Let me bring in my colleague Susan Tehrani, who is with us live from New York. Susan, as Donald Trump heads into these talks or negotiations with Vladimir Putin, there's got to be some lines that he's drawn for himself, because he is not going to agree to everything that is going to be said by his Russian counterpart. Because the Russians have made their position fairly clear. The Americans have said that they want to probably work with some kind of a give and take formula for the exchange of territory. In your assessment, from the talks that you're picking up at your end, what do you think would be a deal that Donald Trump, in fact, can go back home and say that this is a victory for him in these negotiations?
So for Donald Trump, a ceasefire and an agreement to a ceasefire or an end to the bloodshed would be ultimately a victory. But President Trump has made clear that he's not going into this negotiation to gain a victory or to negotiate on the part of Ukraine. He said ultimately what needs to be done is Ukraine and Russia need to sit in the same room and hammer out their differences. He said that he's not going to be talking about territorial concessions during this meeting. Now, what he could do, and what we have been hearing, is that he's been talking to the Ukrainians and he's been talking to the Europeans. A lot of the land that Russia controls right now in Ukraine is very heavily fortified in rare minerals. There is this notion that President Trump may be offering rare earth mineral incentives in those areas that Russia occupies right now and hopes to occupy in the near future, as a way of incentivizing Russia to stop the war and not carry the war any further that it has in Ukraine. That kind of incentive, putting forth by the United States with the agreement of Ukraine, may be an incentive for the Russian president to take home for himself as a victory. But as for Donald Trump, I think coming out of this meeting and setting that second meeting that he's very keen on setting up, which is between Vladimir Zelensky and President Putin and possibly the European leaders, that I think would be somewhat of a win and a next step forward for the United States, saying that, I talked to Russia. I think we can get these two in the same room and, to ultimately figure out what they want to do. But I think that's what he's looking for. Listen, the bar is very low. He's set it very low for this meeting, despite the fact that, of course, it has such huge ramifications. But he knows that he can't guarantee anything right now prior.
He can't guarantee anything right now, but a lot, of course, hinges on the outcome of the meeting, because the stakes could not be higher. Now, the American president, all through his campaigning days, had said that he can bring about a deal within 24 hours of taking charge. He's now been in charge for 8 months. He's meeting the Russian president now. At this moment, a lot of people would turn around and say that if the American president probably oversees a deal where Ukraine ends up losing territory to Russia, then that would be tantamount to surrender to the Russian president. How would that play out politically for the American president?
That's very true. And that's why he says that he doesn't want to get involved in any negotiation that determines whether or not and what kind of land swap will ultimately take place. But we've heard it from President Trump. And I think, the 24-hour question, a reporter brought it up, and he was very frank in saying that he thought it was going to be the easiest conflict to resolve. He said that he made a mistake. He didn't know it was going to be this hard, because ultimately it takes two to tango. And the warring sides were just not willing to come to the negotiating table. So he couldn't pull any miracles regarding that. But ultimately, it'll be very, again, the devil's going to be in the detail, because once Ukraine gives these territorial concessions, then Volodymyr Zelensky has to go back home and give that message to his people. And that's going to be not only very detrimental for him politically at home, but Europe is also watching very closely as well and wondering whether or not any of their capitals are next. For whatever reason, yes or no, true or false, Europeans think that the Russians aren't going to stop at Ukraine. They're going to come and try to conquer the entirety of the European continent. That's something that they're concerned about. So President Trump has a very difficult task here. He does try to pull himself away from the negotiations between the two sides, but he's also the mediator at the end of the day. And I think that when he says, when J.D. Vance says, when Scott Bessent says, when everyone in his administration says that there has to be some kind of territorial concessions, I think that the Ukrainians are preparing for something like that. But what they'll get in return, I think, is going to be also equally as important.
That, of course, is something we'll have to wait and watch out as to how this negotiation, of course, progresses. Dr. Sergey Markov, if I can bring you in on this, because the Russian president will be meeting with the American president in roughly 45 minutes from now. There has to be some level of give and take for any negotiation to have both sides come out and say that they have got what they wanted. In your assessment, because you've been a former advisor to the Russian president, what do you think the Russian president Vladimir Putin is going to be willing to concede as a part of these negotiations to accommodate, some of the challenges that Donald Trump has in these negotiations?
First of all, let me add a few words about territories.
Right.
To be clear, for people to understand. There are two different things. One is formula exchange of territories to the peace, that Ukraine giving territories to Russia and Russia stop its army. It doesn't work because the Russian army will continue its offensive until Western countries, Western Western masters of neo-colonial Ukrainian regime would agree to stop making project anti-Russia by terror from the Ukrainians. It's first. Another issue is Donald Trump suggested exchange of territories during ceasefire. It's rational things. Donald Trump suggested that Ukraine should give to Russia something about 7,000 square kilometers from, in fact, Russian Donbass region to Russia, and Russia should give 1,500 square kilometers which Russian army took from Ukrainian regions, Sumy, Kharkov, Nikolaev, and Dnipropetrovsk region. And this territorial exchange will make ceasefire more stable. That it's what Russia agree, and which is now Donald Trump making pressure on Zelensky to agree this. And this exchange of territories could be the point for the triangle meeting between Putin, Zelensky, and Trump, which I think quite probably to happen 1 week from now.
You expect a trilateral meeting of Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, and Volodymyr Zelensky to happen in a week's time from now. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, exactly.
This is an interesting formula that you've suggested. If this is how things play out, it's going to be interesting to see as to how acceptable, it is going to be for the American side and also for the Russian side. But the question that I also want to press you on, Dr. Markov, is this. If you try to push the Americans into a corner in these negotiations, then they'll feel compelled to back the Ukrainian war effort. Is that a factor that Vladimir Putin would have factored in as he heads into these negotiations?
Of course, everybody understands that Russian army now is winning. Russian army is going forward. And Ukrainian army not only losing, but a lot of military experts, they are thinking about possibility of Ukrainian army to crack down any moment. Maybe next week, maybe next month, maybe next year. But the pressure of Russian army is increasing. And as a result, if it will not ceasefire or peace deal, everybody understands that Ukrainian army sometime will dishandle, will be crashed on the piece of the front line. It's the crucial point of reason of this negotiation. It's for sure. But Donald Trump, same time, I say, he not so much care about Ukrainian regime. He doesn't like Zelensky. He hates, I would say, Zelensky. What Donald Trump is thinking about, he wants to bring peace and to get a Nobel Peace Prize because of this.
It's interesting. You say that Donald Trump wants to do this because he wants to get a Nobel Peace Prize by bringing about peace. Do you think Russia would want to nominate Donald Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize if a deal were to be struck today?
Absolutely. And Putin regards Donald Trump as potentially personal friend and potentially a political ally. Because they have common values, the same generation, baby boomer generation, and they have similar, same, I would say, enemies politically, liberal globalists.
All right.
So Vladimir Putin, I think, want to develop relations with Donald Trump beyond just American crisis.
All right.
We want to establish bilateral relations and to have different projects as well.
All right. Interesting. Some very interesting ideas that have been put forth by you there. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Sergey Markov, for joining us all the way from Moscow and sharing those insights with us. We need to wait and watch as to how these negotiations, of course, proceed, because this is not going to be an easy negotiation by any stretch of the imagination. And my colleague Susan Tehrani is still with us from New York. Susan, we are still waiting for President Donald Trump to, in fact, step out of his Air Force One flight. We expect that he might do so any moment now. So we heard from our guest who joined us from Russia, who put forth some very interesting sort of ideas where Russia perhaps would want to take more regions from Donbas and in return, as a concession, may cede some of the territory that it has captured from areas such as Kharkiv and Mykolaiv. This appears to be the plan that perhaps has been put forth by Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's special envoy for Russia. But at this moment, the expectation from the American side is fairly low. Caroline Levitt, she in fact said that this is more going to be a hearing exercise. But realistically speaking, if Donald Trump is not able to strike a deal in this meeting today, another meeting is not going to happen. So with that being the case, how do you think Donald Trump is approaching these talks and what is likely to play out from here on?
Yeah, the thing about Donald Trump is he's not an ideologue. He doesn't really go based on ideology that perhaps previous administration have gone when dealing with Russia. He's a realist, that he's a businessman. So he wants to get a deal done, and he wants it to be very realistic. He believes that he has the tools that he needs in his tool chest to pressure Russia if Russia decides to not agree to some sort of ceasefire and some kind of negotiated settlement. But he hopes that, he can bring about peace. That's, this is what he's been trying to say. He says that the bloodshed and the killing has to stop. And that's the first and foremost aim of him going into this meeting. You could see a scenario where if the two sides decide to walk away, which is very unlikely at this point, once you get to this point, it means that so many officials from both sides have been talking for so long that these two men have decided to come together because they know that there is a chance. President Trump says 75% chance that we're going to have a good meeting, 25% chance we're not. He gives that 25% chance. But ultimately, that's what he hopes to achieve. But I think it's really far-fetching if we're looking for any kind of quote-unquote deal after this meeting. President Trump said that he can't put forth a deal because America is not one of the warring sides in the Russia-Ukraine war. So ultimately, any kind of tangible deal has to involve Ukraine. And Russia may not like that. Russia has said that, there's just it's noise coming from Europe. The Ukrainians are secondary. But ultimately, that's going to be a very hard sell, not only for the people in Ukraine, for the Europeans around the world, and also for people who are watching capitals around the world, watching how Russia is going to operate. If it's willing to just sideline one side, talk to the mediator and reach a deal, then that sort of puts this international order that we've known for so long, especially after the Cold War, really into jeopardy. And again, not ideologically, but physically what that entails, it's going to just entail more weapons coming from the United States, possibly, definitely from Europe, starting to arm Ukraine, and you're just going to be back to square A. I don't think any of the sides really want that, despite the fact that Russia has made some advances in Ukraine. It is, to a certain extent, struggling economically when you look at its GDP.
Right.
It has the power to continue the war more than Ukraine, but ultimately Russia sees this to its benefit as well, to try to find peace. But again, as much as Vladimir Putin might want to put an end to this, he has to convince the Russians as well.
That of course, is a crucial point there. Do continue to stay on with us, Susan Tehrani. On the screens, you've got the plane of the Russian President Vladimir Putin, which has just touched down at this moment at the joint base Elmendorf-Richardson in Alaska. So the Russian president's plane has also just touched down. These are live images that we're getting from the joint base Elmendorf-Richardson, Alaska. Now, President Donald Trump, his plane, the Air Force One plane, has also touched down. He's still on board inside of this Air Force One plane, awaiting President Vladimir Putin's arrival. And the American president is talking inside of the plane with Alaska's senators Lisa Murkowski and Dan Sullivan, as well as the state's governor Mike Dunleavy, according to the White House. The Russian president's plane has just taxied in, and this is the big moment. The two presidents are at this moment at the joint base Elmendorf-Richardson in Alaska, and we'd expect both of them, I would assume, to step out pretty much simultaneously and then meet each other. This is a pretty big meeting which has a lot of ramifications on not just about the war in Ukraine, but about the European security question as well. And we need to wait and watch as to how things proceed from here. Because remember, the stakes could not be bigger. This is the big stage, and we need to wait and watch out for as to how the two leaders approach this. The Russians on the battlefield may have the upper hand, but bear in mind, economy plays a big role. The Americans are dangling the carrot of probably better financial deals, lifting of the sanctions, and in case a deal does not happen, of crippling tariffs and sanctions, which can badly devastate the economy. These are the stakes that we are looking at. But the long-term ramifications are going to be just simply enormous. The future of NATO will be called into question. The European security question will, of course, be called into question. And these are some pretty big moments that we are looking at unfold right in front of us. So this is what the scene looks like at the joint base Elmendorf-Richardson in Alaska. The planes of the two leaders, the American President Donald Trump, his Air Force One, touched down a little while back, about half an hour ago. But the American president is still inside of the plane. And the Russian president's plane has just landed, and preparations are now underway for the two leaders to step out. And this is going to be a big, big moment in international diplomacy, with ramifications for the global economy and for the global security order. And it needs to be seen as to see how things will proceed from here. Ukraine, of course, is not a part of this meeting, but we had a guest from Russia, a former advisor to President Vladimir Putin, who in fact indicated that if things go well, then we could have a trilateral meeting which would include Volodymyr Zelensky in a week's time, which could potentially bring an end to the war. But provided, remember, it's a big if everything goes according to plan. Because Donald Trump has said several conflicting things. He has said that he's going in with very low expectations, but he's also said that he's not going to be happy if a deal does not happen today in Alaska. Alaska is also a very interesting choice of venue. This was originally Russian territory till about 140 odd years ago. It was sold by the Russians to the Americans in the year 1867. And Vladimir Putin is now going to be the Russian president who will meet the American president on Alaskan territory to negotiate a deal on Ukraine. There's a lot that is riding on this particular meeting between the two leaders, and we need to wait and watch out as to how things proceed from here. Because remember, the stakes could not be bigger.